It's a great pleasure to be here for the second time. My last time I was here on this podium was 2011, and we had a very lively debate with someone representing J Street. This time I am a bit of alone a little bit, but thank God there are two people next to me, so this is a bit of a return to 6 years ago. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for making the effort to bring me over. Particularly, I want to mention McDonald Sullivan, who really chased me physically all around the globe to make sure that I will not forget my promise to come back. So thank you, Don, for your steadfastness. For those of us who are longtime activists on Palestine, and those of us who teach on Palestine either as official academics or as part of our activism or any other occupation that leads us to engage with the problem of Palestine, there is a growing frustration, I think, about the gap between the way the mainstream media, in a way also the mainstream academia, and definitely the mainstream politics depict the conflict in Israel and Palestine on the one hand, and what we feel is the essence of the conflict, what we feel is the reason for the conflict and the lack of progress in the attempts to solve it. Even if you read the New York Times in this country, even if you hear academics and politicians who are not denying the existence of a Palestinian people, who probably have been even to the West Bank, if not to the Gaza Strip, even when you hear these people, and let alone if you listen to those who haven't been there and who are not as open-minded as the New York Times, for instance, or the Washington Post, even if you hear the most progressive one and the less progressive one, the way that they tend to explain the origins of the conflict, the essence of the conflict, the reasons for any lack of progress in solving the conflict, is very far, I think, from the way we understand it, from the way we sense it in the last 20 or 30 years. And for many years, I thought maybe the problem is that these people, whether progressive enough or not progressive enough, maybe the problem is that they're not spending enough time in the West Bank. Maybe they haven't seen enough of the Israeli atrocities on a daily basis. Maybe they should have more access to what goes on in the Gaza Strip. Maybe what is missing is more information. And then I came across these same people in government, in academia, in the media, being exposed to more information, and yet they remain loyal to the same basic assumptions, wrong assumptions, about the conflict, its origins, its essence, and the chances to solve it. And this is why I think that the problem is not only lack of knowledge of what goes on currently in Palestine. The problem is not even the fact that next door to Israel and Palestine, even worse atrocities are being committed, which is the new excuse we hear for why Palestine is removed from the international attention and why there is lack of international interference in what goes on. I don't think these are the reasons. I don't undermine the importance of people being well informed of what goes on today in Palestine. I don't underestimate the importance of the events in Syria and Iraq in shadowing what goes on in Palestine. I take this all into account. But even with all these explanations, I still find the basic understanding of why there is a conflict in Palestine and Israel, and why this conflict is so crucial for the future of the Middle East and beyond, is very far from what people like myself, and I suspect quite a lot of those who are here tonight, feel about the conflict, its origin, and its future. And the only way, I think, of challenging the wrong perceptions of Palestine, the misinformed assumptions that lead to the diplomatic effort that leads to nowhere, that create a charade about Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, or create this narrative that peace is very nearby, around the corner, and all you need is either an able Palestinian leader or a brave Israeli leader, and that's, or maybe a grown-up American mediator, which is not exactly what we have in this moment in time. And then the issue is resolved. The only way of challenging these misconceptions, unfortunately for us as activists, is to go back to history. Why do I say unfortunately? Because this is the 21st century. People don't have, it seems, time and energy to listen to long, profound analyses. People prefer sound bites. They want binary explanation, who is bad, who is good. They want it in 3 to 4 minutes. The span of attention is no longer than 5 minutes. We are defeated by the very technology sometimes that enable us in a way to bring more information on what goes on in Israel and Palestine today. There is no way of understanding what goes on today, to my mind, in the right context, unless you are also a student of history. And the reason you have to be a student of history is not because of an intellectual interest in the past. No, this is not the reason. It is because the historical chapter that began in Palestine with the arrival of the Zionist movement is still going on today. We have not concluded that chapter. We are in the same time zone as the beginning of Zionism. This is not, we don't have a closure of that chapter. So we're not actually going to study history. We're going to study our own contemporary reality, even if that particular moment began 70 years ago, or maybe even 100 years ago. And there is a very good explanation why we are still in the same time zone when Zionism started, and why are we still faced with the same problems that Zionists put in front of us as Palestinians, as Jews, and as people around the world who are interested in Israel and Palestine. We have to deal with Zionism as a structure, not as an event. It's a structure. And a structure in history means that, yes, there is a moment when this structure is exposed, when this structure begins, but we are still inside this structure. And that particular structure, which is we are in, recently was very well defined by scholars in various parts of the world. That particular structure is settler colonialism. In fact, one of the great writers on settler colonialism who just passed away, unfortunately, Patrick Wolfe, has this famous quote where he says, "Settler colonialism is not an event, it is a structure." I translated to my particularly case study Zionism is not an event, it is a structure. And it is a settler colonialist structure. Now, in Israel, at this point, even those who wouldn't understand what settler colonialism is would walk out of this hall. The fact that you are still here after I said that Zionism is settler colonialism made this trip worthwhile. And most of those people who would walk out from the hall really wouldn't know what settler colonialism is, but they would be offended by the word colonialism. 2 years ago, I organized a conference in my university, the University of Exeter, under the title Settler Colonialism in Palestine. And immediately there was an outcry in Britain. The Board of Deputies, which is the main Jewish organization, various pro-Israeli lobbies, even the Prime Minister's office at the time was David Cameron, called my university and said, you have to stop this conference from taking place because it's an anti-Semitic conference. To his credit, my vice-chancellor said to the politicians who called him, do you know what settler colonialism is? And they said, no, but it doesn't sound good. He said, well, he said, you should come to Exeter and attend the conference. You may learn something about settler colonialism. And this is typical. This is part of the obstacle we face if we want to have a serious, profound, analytical discussion about Palestine. And we need. There's no way of going around it. There's no way of having a soundbite exchange about Palestine. There's only a moment where there comes a moment where you say to people, yes, it is complicated. Yes, it's information that takes time to take in. But if you really think that Palestine and Israel are important, you will have to make the effort. I always am bewildered when I'm on such stages with some of my compatriots from Israel who are supposed to present the opposite side, when they use the same sentence that I'm using about the reality as being complicated for exactly the opposite purpose. They would say to the audience, this is such a complicated story, you will never understand it. So leave it to us, we understand what it is all about. No, intelligent people, educated people don't need much time to understand, but it's important to understand, or at least to comprehend, that there is a total misunderstanding about what goes on from the level of the politicians, so the highest levels of politicians, through mainstream media, mainstream academia. Part of the misunderstanding is intentional, part of it is people who grew up in a certain ideological or theological or cultural environment that does not allow them to see the reality in Israel and Palestine in any different way from the way their parents or their communities were conditioned to see. So let me go back to this idea of settler colonialism, because I think it's a crucial point. Settler colonialism, as you would know from the history of this country, is the movement of Europeans outside of Europe. And these people are moving outside of Europe in different moments in time. And mostly these movements are different from the expansion of empires into other parts of the world. These are movements of communities, of individuals, sometimes according to the lines of imperial expansion, sometimes preceding imperial expansion or following imperial expansion. Most of these people are persecuted for various reasons. And most of these people have no wish to stay in Europe and are looking for a new home. And they want also, when it comes to the 18th century, 19th century, they want to create also a new homeland. And in many cases, the main obstacle for creating a new safe homeland for people who were victims of persecution is the fact that they choose places where someone else is already living. And that's a problem. And that's a problem. And in many cases, the settlers dehumanize the natives and the indigenous to such an extent that they find it in their heart to genocide them, to eliminate them, or to impose an apartheid system on them, or, as in the case of the Palestine, to strive and get them out of their homeland, or as I called it in 2007, to ethnically cleanse them from their homeland. If we can, at any given moment, if at any given moment we can explain to people that there were many positive impulses behind Zionism, very noble, I would say even, impulses behind Zionism. The wish to save the Jews from what definitely was eventually a genocide in Europe. The wish of people to become modern and a modern nation. Even the wish to be reconnected to the Holy Land or the land of the Bible. These are all not negative impulses. These are understandable. But you cannot exclude the additional impulse which complicated life for all of us. The other impulse that is not talked about is to get rid of the people who were already there in the land of the Bible, that were already modernized themselves, that were already building a national identity and collective identity, who lived there for centuries and were entitled to continue their normal life and to make their own decisions about the future, whether they were good decisions or bad decisions. This is totally irrelevant. This was their homeland, and someone else came, immigrated into their homeland, and slowly but surely began to expel them and dispossess them in a process that started 100 years ago and reached a climax in 1948. There's no escaping from this. There's no way of rewriting that history. There's no escape from telling the Israeli Jews, your ideology of who you are and who the Palestinians are was formed in that historical moment when your grandfathers and grandmothers, your modern ancestors, decided what quite a lot of Europeans decided elsewhere in the world, that in order to create a safe homeland, yes, in order to create or reconstruct ancient Israel, call it what you want, you were fully aware that the only way you could do it is by getting rid of the Palestinian population. And there is no escape because it exists in every travelogue that your leaders have written on the way to Palestine. It appears in every diary that they kept. It is to be found in the archives of the Zionist movement and the archives of the Israeli state. You didn't hide it in 1882 because it was quite legitimate to talk about depopulation in 1882. You didn't even feel it was wrong to ask the British government in 1930 to help you to transfer all the Palestinians outside of Palestine because this was an accepted language in 1930. So we don't blame you for being the same as many other European settlers who came to a different place. But you came very late in the day, and the Palestinians, to their credit, resisted you in the name of Palestinian nationalism. In 1936, they began a serious revolt against you, against the idea that you had the right to dispossess them, not that you have the right to live next to them. This you had the right, and they never denied you the right to live next to them. They resisted against your plan to dispossess them. And had not the British government helped the Zionist movement between 1936 to 1939 to destroy the Palestinian military elite and political elite, probably the resistance would have been even more successful than it was. And when you had, as Zionists, a great historical moment in 1948 to translate the idea of dispossession of the Palestinians from an abstract strategy that a small minority of Jews in mandatory Palestine could not implement, to translate it into a proper military strategy of expulsion, you did it. You understood very well as a political movement that 3 years after the Holocaust, the world would allow you to expel the Palestinians and wouldn't do anything against it. You knew that there was no leadership on the Palestinian side. You knew that the Arab world was busy with its own liberation struggles. Yes, you were very clever as politicians, as leaders of a political movement. 48 was the right moment to do it, especially because the British decided to leave Palestine. And you manipulated very well the international community to depict the Palestinians as the people who resist peace, who refuse to accept peace. You offered them to partition their homeland and to leave them 50% of their homeland, and you described their rejection of this generous offer, a term you will use again and again in your dealings with the Palestinians, as intransigence, as typical of a political culture in the Arab world, not progressive, not modern enough. And that's why the people of Palestine foolishly did not agree to give half of their homeland to a group of hundreds of thousands of Jews. Most of them arrived in Palestine only 2 years before. Who wouldn't in the world say, I will give half of my country to immigrants who have just arrived 2 years ago? The cynical way in which so many people accepted that this was a foolish Palestinian position, that it had no moral basis, that it had no political wisdom. The cynical stance was so powerful that even some Palestinians began to believe in it, that it was a terrible mistake in 1947 not to accept the solution of partitioning Palestine to an Arab state and a Jewish state. And remember, the Jews were 1/3 of the population. Most of them came in 1945, and they had an ideology of ethnic cleansing that anyway would have been implemented even if the Palestinians would have accepted the partition plan. And yet, even among people around the world who support the idea of two-state solution, you can hear them saying the Palestinians made a terrible mistake in 1947 when they rejected the partition plan. Not to mention the Israeli propaganda that wants to show it that Palestinians were always rejecting peace plans. This particular peace plan ended in the expulsion of half of Palestine's population and the demolition of 500 Palestinian villages out of 1,000, in the destruction of all the Palestinian towns except for one town, the town of Nazareth. And this all happened in 9 months. The world was watching, the world knew exactly what was going on, and the world was silent about the Palestinian tragedy. And the message from the world brings us back to the idea of settler colonialism as a structure. If the international community in 1948 would have said to Israel, colonialism, settler colonialism, this belongs to the 19th century. We are in a different century. 3 years after the Holocaust, we do not sanction massive expulsions of people just because of their identity. Imagine if that would be the international community saying. And to the credit of someone who I don't like, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State in 1949, to his credit, I should say, for the record, he's the only international statesman who said what I'm saying here. To his credit. In fact, he succeeded in convincing President Truman for a few months to impose sanctions on Israel for not allowing the Palestinian refugees to return. And then he was silenced, and America reorientated its policy, as you know, towards Israel and Palestine to the lines that we are familiar with today. But no one else had even thought of sending a message to Israel that this is not the way to compensate the Jewish people for the genocide that happened in Europe. This is not the way to build a secure, democratic Jewish homeland on Palestine, at the expense of Palestine, without succeeding in fully defeating the Palestinians. So the message from the world was, if you haven't completed your settler colonialist project, why don't you continue it? You will continue to have international immunity. So between 1948 and 1967, Israel expelled from within Israel another 36 villages. The Palestinians who were left, out of the 1 million Palestinians who lived in what was Israel, 150,000 were left. They were put under military rule. Those who live today in the West Bank know exactly what a military rule means. It means that a soldier is a little king in his kingdom and can destroy your shop, can prevent you from going to university, can arrest you without trial, can shoot and kill you without being worried about it. The Palestinian citizens of Israel were under such military rule between 1948 to 1966. And it's fascinating to read the reports of the State Department about this situation. How they accept, cynically I think, the Israeli explanation that this is temporary and therefore nobody in the world should really pay much attention to the fact that 1/5 of the Israeli population doesn't enjoy basic human and civil rights. So the message came loud and clear when in 1967 Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and incorporated another group, even larger group of Palestinians under Israeli rule. We have the documents from the Israeli meetings immediately after the occupation. And what these documents reveal is how the biggest charade on earth was designed. The Israeli government in 1967, and yes, Mary, this is another book written on a plane that will come out in June called The Biggest Prison on Earth. I tell about these cabinet meetings because I think they're very important. In the Israeli cabinet or government in 1967 had to decide, or was the first group of politicians that had to decide what to do with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was a unique group of people, the members of the cabinet in 1967. It was the 13th government of Israel. And it was the most consensual government Israel ever had and ever is going to have. Every shade of the political parties in Israel was represented in that government. Socialists alongside Zionists, capitalists, ultra-Orthodox Jews alongside very secular Jewish parties. Everyone was part of that government, and I think that's why that government felt, rightly, that it represents Zionism in full. And they took 3 decisions that were the basis for the charade, that we all, hopefully not here, but so many of us still play with. The first decision was that Israel could not exist without the West Bank. And this is something that it's even hard to explain to Palestinians in the West Bank that still believe in a 2-state solution. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right within the Zionist politics in Israel. 1967 was seen as the historical moment, not just from a religious perspective, namely that you were given all the ancient biblical towns that are the heart of the ancient kingdom, but that strategically you got rid of what Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister at the time, called the Auschwitz borders of Israel. The government was very clear that in no circumstances could Israel exist without the West Bank. They had only tactical disagreement of how best to achieve it. And it was so fascinating for me as an historian is how these tactical disagreement was seen in the world as genuine ideological disagreement about Zionism. These are tactical. Whether you are on the left and say, I don't have to control every part of the West Bank, I can build a wall, which is what liberal Zionists decided to do. I can build a wall around the West Bank, so I don't need to control it, but I only need to control the River Jordan. Or you are a right wing who said, no, I have to, because of ideology, I have to be in every part of the West Bank. It doesn't matter. In the end of the day, the West Bank, which is 20% of Palestine, cannot be really out of Israel's reach and control and rule. Yes, there is the realpolitik of the pragmatic left that says rule does not have to be official, rule doesn't have to be formal, and the ideological stance of the right wing in Israel that says, no, we need to show that this belongs to us. Every square inch belongs to us. In the end of the day, it means that those of us who believe in a two-state solution should understand that as long as Israel is the powerful party that it is, there will never be a Palestinian state to talk about, a real Palestinian state in the West Bank. So that was the first decision. The second decision was, okay, we keep the territories and we will argue for years how best to keep it. But what we will do with the people. There was a genuine discussion of whether Israel should not repeat in 1967 what it did in 1948. Because settler colonialism is a structure. It's a DNA. It's not a policy. And they had a serious discussion whether they had the capacity and the circumstances to expel millions of Palestinians so that the West Bank could be easily Judaized. They decided that in 1967 you cannot do what you could do in 1948. A, because the war was already over. Secondly, there was television. Thirdly, many of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were refugees from 1948, and there was a fear that they would resist even strongly the second expulsion than they did resist the first expulsion. And there was even worried about the reactions of Syria and Jordan and Egypt, the countries where we're supposed to receive these masses of refugees. So they decided not to expel the people. So if you keep the territory and you don't expel the people, what would be the status of the people? They discussed it. Surprisingly, the leader of the right-wing party, Menachem Begin, said, well, in that case, we should grant them citizenship. That makes sense. And the Labour Party, that was the dominant ideological power in 1967, said, you're crazy. We cannot have a Jewish state if we don't have a demographic majority of Jews. A Jewish democratic state means you have to make sure all the time that the Jews are the majority. So if you grant them citizenship, you downsize the number of Jews in the Jewish state to dangerous levels. So Begin asked the Minister of Defense at the time, Moshe Dayan, so what do you suggest? And he said, well, you know, they would be without any citizenship. And Abba Eban, the foreign minister, asked, for how many years can people live without basic civil rights and human rights? And the chilling response from Moshe Dayan was, well, at least for 50 years. Today, we are in the 50th years of this inhumanity that was devised in 1967. But where is the charade? And with this, I would come to a close. The charade was that the 13th government of Israel understood that it would have a problem with the international community if these three decisions would be the only decisions the government had been taken, even if there were secret decisions that at the time were not publicized. So they took a fourth decision, and that was to have a peace process. On the basis that Israel can never give up the West Bank, on the basis that the citizens of the West Bank, the inhabitants of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would never be expelled, although they were massively expelled for various reasons, but not in the same way as in 1948, and on the basis that they would never be granted citizenship by the Israelis. But the peace process, as the Israelis understood very well, as Noam Chomsky once commented rightly, the important word is not peace. The important word is process. Process doesn't have to lead to anywhere. It goes on and on and on, and you can create the sense that it's temporary, that the reality is temporary, that you are waiting for something good to happen, and you're doing all the bad things that you are doing because there's no peace. But there is a process. And as long as there's a process, you demand international immunity. Now, you can rely, and they knew it beforehand, you can rely on the fact that the kind of prison that you created for the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would be resisted. You can also rely on the fact that if you, as the Israeli government, not someone on the extreme right, begin to send Jewish settlers to colonize the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, you'll be even more confident that the people there would resist. Resistance allows you to retaliate and to be even more brutal. It's amazing how for 50 years, and it doesn't matter which government and which political party you were talking about, for 50 years, whenever Palestinian resistance emerged, the Israeli response was to build more settlements, to give the Palestinians less rights than they had, to install more checkpoints, to build a wall, to use the Air Force for the first time to carpet bomb the city of Jenin in 2002, to destroy the city of Gaza with scenes that we've only seen before in the Second World War. This was all done as a response, as retaliation for these Palestinian terrorists. But they were not terrorists. They were people who resisted the 1967, and still resist, the 1967 creation of the biggest prison on earth, one in the West Bank and one in the Gaza Strip. And they will continue to resist. And the Israelis would continue to say, well, if they continue to resist, we have to build more settlements. We have to extend the wall. We have to make it higher than it is. And we are entitled to use even more inhuman lethal weapons in Gaza. There is a direct line between the international legitimacy to Zionism and settler colonialism in Palestine and the international immunity and silence to the most recent Israeli atrocities, and you can take your pick, because it's very difficult to highlight which of the last Israeli policies in 2016 is worse than the other. And don't forget that this ideology of settler colonialism is not limited to the West Bank, is not limited to the Gaza Strip. There are Palestinian villages in the south of Israel that have been demolished for the 40th, if not the 50th time. Their crime? That they tried to build and maintain a village which was there for centuries. There are demolition of houses all over the Palestinian areas inside Israel in order to downsize both the space in which Palestinians live and the numbers of Palestinians. And there are legislation going on in Israel, which is the natural consequences of a settler colonialist mentality that does not allow the Palestinians to commemorate 1948 as a catastrophe, does not recognize them as part of the nation of the state, does not recognize their language as a language of the state. I'm sure that from the point of view of international law, almost 95% of the Israeli laws that were passed in the Knesset about the Palestinians, and 100% of the practices on the ground would be regarded as severe violation of the most basic international law. And I'm not talking, again, about only what's happening in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also inside Israel itself, where by law you can declare a whole town a town for Jews alone. Imagine if a city in America would be declared only for Christians. What an outcry would it be there? In a law, not by practice, which is bad enough, by a law. So we have to ask ourselves, how does Israel get away with this? So I come to the beginning of my talk, and with this I would end. It gets away with it because people do not know the history I was giving you today. And when I and my friends are trying to tell this history, a huge effort is being made to undermine our scholarly credentials, our knowledge, but they're losing. They're losing. We are recognized by the international community as good scholars, as reliable scholars, as truthful scholars. The question is, can now that the truth is known, now that people know they cannot hide behind ignorance, would they have the courage to help us save the Palestinians from another 100 years of suffering? Thank you.